billion by 2025. And fertility apps alone have raised over $350 million over the past few years. One of these apps, the fertility app Glow, is backed by PayPal co-founder Max Levchin. The app reminds users to update it with all their intimate data about their sex lives, alcohol consumption, ovulation tests, and it invites a woman to give her partner access to her info and notifies the partner when it's the time of the month when she's most fertile. And it even offers advice such as bringing a bouquet to her when it's the right time of the month. One engineer who worked on these fertility apps said that many of these apps are designed by men and they're focused on women's moods, so grouchy, touchy, horny, and often will even gamify the process of getting pregnant. So, for example, the fact, this was actually how they promoted it. The fact that menstruation and fertility is almost always linked in these apps already suggests that women's reproductive potential is what society deems most useful, argues Deborah Lupton. Fertility tracking apps, which are often developed and designed by men, suggest that women tracking their period is important primarily in terms of a woman's reproductive potential. The ultimate goal is pregnancy. Lupton says, quote, "When you look at these type of ads, they're completely about the surveillance of pregnant women and making them ever more responsible and vigilant about their bodies for the sake of their fetus." So, Glow and other self-tracking period apps collect a great deal of private, intimate data about users. How often they have periods, but also their diets, whether they've had an abortion, their sex lives, their stress levels. And a lot of these apps have recently come under fire when it was discovered that their entire business model was built on selling aggregated data to marketers. And according to research done by a Brazilian NGO called Coding Rights, Glow is one of the worst offenders in terms of the scope and amount of data it collects. And a number of companies have contracted Glow to use data for targeted advertising. And this is a visual representation of what that looks like that Coding Rights has put together. So what we're seeing is modernity, according to Sean Heyer, has ushered in the proliferation of information and data gathering techniques that, quote, operate to break the human body into a number of discrete signifying data flows. The biopoliticization of populations creates this disjuncture between the data and the living body it represents, and these assemblages of surveillance engender a relation in which the technology functions as a surrogate for the human body. So while promoting a vision of self-discovery and empowerment to women, these apps have also been effectively commodifying and reducing human bodies into impersonal data flows. More recently, corporate wellness programs have begun incentivizing employees to use fitness trackers like the Fitbit to monitor the collective health of the workforce. Self-tracking has a normalizing effect on our bodies as we submit to fantasies of disembodiment and complete control and productivity. The self-controlling self of neoliberalism, writes Rose, calculates about itself and works upon itself in order to better itself. So now, self-tracking fertility apps are being aggressively pushed by employers and health insurers to exercise more control over female workers' health lives. In a recent Washington Post article, I think this was literally from last week, this article details how, with the fertility tracking app Ovia, employers pay to get access to intimate data about their employees. The aggregated, anonymized data includes how many workers are using it, who had complicated pregnancies and births, and how soon employees planned to come back to work. This is a slide from some of the marketing materials that Ovia Health has put together. So the Ovia app and other period trackers like it is designed to benefit employers, not their workers. Employers are sold on the idea of cutting back on medical costs and nudging women to come back to work. And for example, Ovia offers fertility algorithms that analyze menstrual data and suggest when someone should conceive, cutting back on costly infertility treatments, and Ovia marketing documents remind employers that, quote, an average of 33 hours of productivity are lost for every round of treatment. To govern, biopower requires dynamic modular categories that have the ability to adapt to the dynamic nature of human populations. Advanced data gathering and analysis techniques, paired with technologies that occupy our most intimate spaces, deepen the ways in which these cybernetic categories act as surrogates for human bodies. And right now, Ovia has over 10 million users, and the company boasts having one of the largest data sets about women's health in the world. So in a neoliberal context, biopower governs at a distance. It articulates norms of what healthy habits look like, and then subjects voluntarily act in accordance with those norms. Fertility and period apps are one example of this new disciplinary technology that pushes women towards normalized modes of interaction. Not only does self-tracking reinforce this narrative that bodies are objects that need to be quantified, analyzed, and hacked, but it also disembodies the individual. In this system, the personal identity of the individual matters less than the categorical profile of the collective body. Thank you.
I want to briefly outline what my PhD research project is about. Simply put, what I'm doing is exploring how various social groups, such as local politicians, news practitioners, religious people, business people, peasant, workers, unemployed, and retired, experience, feel, and communicate the impacts of globalization in their everyday lives within and across this Brazilian city of Catalão. Catalão is located in Brazil's backlands, at the southeast of the state of Goiás, and 190 miles from Brasilia, the national capital. The Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics estimated that in 2018, there were over 106,000 inhabitants in the locality. In terms of GDP, Catalão is among the 200 wealthiest cities in Brazil, which has a total of 5,570 municipalities. It is known as the locality of automaker factories such as Mitsubishi and John Deere, and multinationals in the mining industry such as CEMOC and Mosaic. My study, however, is primarily concerned with the mediated life force of various groups in Catalão, with their experience of globalization and how these are shared, and with the feelings that emerge from everyday conversations and interviews, from daily interactions in social media platforms and the local media. One of the key aspects of my research is how feelings and moods are put into circulation and shape the social environment of this particular locality. From a theoretical perspective, I draw on scholars such as Ben Highmore and his work on cultural feelings, and Laura Berland's concept of the historical sensorium and crisis ordinariness, to provide some of the foundations for my ethnographic approach, which helps me to explore the overarching structuring effects of globalization occurring at the level of feelings and moods. For this specific paper, I am interested in the effective impact of crisis ordinariness. What I mean by this is a notion of systemic crisis, which includes long-term systemic sexism, racism, and class inequalities, as well as the impact of big events such as the 2007 subprime banking crisis and the subsequent global financial crackdown that escalated into a major corruption scandal and a thick, widespread political turmoil in Brazil, all of which continue to exist in such a way that they can be seen as ordinary rather than extraordinary or unique or new. So what I'm looking at is how the effective impact of crisis ordinariness takes form, becomes mediated when something else happens, like the truck driver strike, which I explore here. I want to start with some background on the strike and how I got involved in it. The strike officially lasted from the 21st of May, 2018, with motorways in 24 Brazilian states blocked by the protesters, leading to shortages of food, medicine, gas, and so on all over the country until the 30th of May, 2018. At that time, I was conducting ethnographic field work in Catalão, which is connected to two important motorways in the country paralyzed due to the trucker strike. Besides tracking and recording the local, national, and international news media coverage, I spent time with the truckers based in the locality, having face-to-face conversations, photographing them, and conducting in-depth interviews with some of them. I also joined a local news WhatsApp group and one of the hundreds of truck drivers groups in the app. Here's some of what I found out. The movement's initial aim of protesting against the increasing price of diesel soon gave way to the fight against the communist government and corruption, with many of the truckers asking for military intervention to clean up the National Congress and then return to normal. At once expressing and refueling this atmosphere of growing discontent were the repeated sharing of memes, religious texts, and fake news in these WhatsApp groups. But also of particular importance were videos of influential businessmen, public figures, and military officials not only expressing their support to the truck drivers, but also helping them with alternative narratives, whose largely inaccurate contents were a melange of biblical tones and anti-communist against the media and pro-military feelings. It was on Wednesday, 23rd of May, the third day of the strike, when I first saw, then heard about this brother go. As I parked my car in a gas station at the margins of the BR-50 motorway, one of the 3 stops of the strike in Catalan, I saw written in the front window of a truck, "Military intervention now." Then, after spending some time with a group of truck drivers, I finally got to ask them about it, and they confirmed. "Look at what's happening in Brazil. It's a big mess. We want change," said one. And then, as if to help me out of my momentary state of confusion, he showed me an 8-minute-long video circulating in WhatsApp groups since early that day. In it, the businessman Emilio Del Socchio, owner of 600 trucks, was with truck drivers mobilized somewhere in the state of São Paulo. He starts with, "What's happening is the result of a lack of history." And as he goes on, it becomes clear that he's not addressing the truck drivers, but speaking on behalf of them. This government, this government that is there, that implanted the dung of communism, and this faculty teachers, you're lying. Brazil had no dictatorship. Brazil had a military regime. Later that day, this video reached the local news WhatsApp group I was in. Since then, more and more similar anti-corruption, communist, the fake media, and pro-military narratives could be found in these WhatsApp groups. For instance, in one of such videos, a politician outlined the real aims of the strike and gave an ultimatum for the government to respond by midnight Monday, 28th of May. After that, they, the truck drivers, would radicalize. In another, and widely shared throughout the weekend, an army sergeant celebrates the news that the military intervention could happen at any moment. So these businessmen, public figures, and military officials did not just declare their support for the strike, they became part of it and managed, through the many forms of influence and appeals, to hijack and amplify its purpose. It became the movement of all Brazilians represented by the truckers for the military intervention. Such interferences, as a result, hugely contributed to fragment the truck driver strike. In other words, these alternative narratives became embedded as part of the trucker stories in ways that eventually reshaped their aims. Specifically here, by changing the focus from issues of diesel prices, then taxes, and a rejection of the political left, especially the Workers' Party, to become a vehicle for far-right-wing political messages. For example, the federal government reached an agreement with representatives of associations and syndicate of truck drivers on Thursday, 24th of May. The former agreed to reduce the diesel price by 10% for 30 days, and the latter to give a halt in the strike. But in these WhatsApp groups, whose members identify themselves as autonomous and independent from these left-wingers organizations, the agreement was not only ineffective, convincing the truckers to unblock the motorways, but intensify their revolt. In this way, such narratives also contributed to transforming the entire mood of the strike itself. For in these WhatsApp groups, as it turned into the broader movement for the military intervention, the mood became much more intensified, so much so that soon it would get entirely disconnected from the offline reality. On Monday, 28th of May, with their original demands already met and the population growing weary of the strike's impacts, the truckers anxiously waited in the group for the midnight strokes, for the military intervention and subsequent liberation of Brazil from all evils. When the hour finally came, not surprisingly, they found no such revolutionary signs in the world outside of WhatsApp. At midnight '07, someone, LS, broke the awkward and painful silence. Folks, this has become a circle. If the army doesn't intervene now, we will be the most disgusting thugs in the world. So what I suggest is that WhatsApp was used during the truck driver strike at once to disseminate right-wing political narratives and as an amplifier of feelings and moods. For the strike, these groups were created with up to 256 people, which means that contents were then disseminated through smaller, more intimate groups such as families, childhood friends, and colleagues from works. These and many more of such groups are built primarily upon foundations of intimacy and a principle of agreement, which I don't have the time to elaborate in detail here. But an example of the latter can also be found in the truckers group, when someone finally pointed out the contradiction of protesting for military intervention, but got subsequently inundated with the same anti-communist, against the fake media, and pro-military videos, as if these videos had, or even, carried the solution in themselves. And as if worn out, the questioner consented, okay, you're right, all right. Interestingly, when the truckers' aims changed from the focus on diesel prices to military intervention, expressing right-wing's anti-communist narratives, the support from social media users went down from 54% to 34%. Here, what was being rejected was precisely their desire and belief for military intervention, and indeed, the truckers themselves and their movement was ultimately rejected. But importantly, the contents of the movement, that is, the overarching anti-communist, anti-corruption narratives and feelings spread throughout spaces in WhatsApp also resonated with the broader population as a result of crisis ordinariness, or pre-existing systemic crisis, and continue to be disseminated through WhatsApp and beyond. In other words, because these alternative narratives, which are at once all-embracing and vague, touch deep feelings of discontent and hopelessness are already widely experienced by all kinds of social groups, though in various forms and degrees of intensity, as such were naturally adopted and shared beyond the truck driver strike. In the end, the truckers got what they aimed for, though it was no longer what they desired. More importantly, the narratives they helped to create and spread through WhatsApp laid the foundations for the upcoming presidential elections. The former military officer and far-right candidate, known as the Donald Trump of the tropics, ran on a platform solely based in the all-embracing and vague narrative of anti-communist and corruption, and voted by the majority of Brazilians with a government program for such a complex, diverse, and extreme socially unjust country with the same depths of a frying pan. In other words, I suggest that WhatsApp was instrumentalized to spread such narratives and feelings, this noise of the political, that could then be re-amplified during the elections to help support anti-left feelings. Nonetheless, from an everyday perspective, neither the strike nor the elections the election of Jair Bolsonaro were revolutionary events. Instead, these are best seen as episodes, or occasions that frame the experience while not changing much of anything. Thank you.
My talk is on the invisible labor of the web. Artificial intelligence is made possible by an undervalued workforce. So, these hands belong to the workers tediously scanning page after page of documents and books amounting to over 30 million volumes. They are scan-up workers working on the ongoing Google Books project that is attempting to digitize the world's library. Despite working on campus in Mountain View, they have the least privileges of a Google employee. These workers have yellow badges, meaning they do not have access to cafeteria, buses, stock options, and many more benefits had by other Googlers. These beautiful mistakes capture the human behind the machine and are documented in the Tumblr, The Art of Google Books. If you look closely at the images of the hand, you can see that many of the workers have painted nails and darker skin tones. these workers are from the most underrepresented groups in tech. Women of color disproportionately hired for data entry work than as full-time tech employees. You might think these books are self-scanned by a machine, but each book is handled by a human. And yet their labor is not considered as valuable as the white-collar workers that build the AI as well. When work is less visible, less credentialed, it becomes less valued. But so much of tech is built by this invisible labor. So techno-utopian visionaries have long preached that AI will free us from work and create abundance. But unfortunately, these dreams were dreamt in a system of exploitation where profit is always prioritized over people. Workers like the book scanners make up the invisible labor force creating the AI. So we must challenge why some workers are more valued than others, and to do this, we must peer into the machine to see the people behind it. Our pop cultures perpetuate the myth that one day soon robots smarter than us will take over, when the reality is most AI is only capable of doing very specific tasks. When we say AI, we mostly mean machine learning, which is a subset domain. Machine learning is no more than advanced statistics with powerful computing that can crunch more data than a human. To understand how human labor is involved with machine learning, it's helpful to understand how it works. Machine learning is made of 3 steps. First, a model is created by a human, and then this model makes prediction based on the data set it has, this data set having also been created by a human. In the 3rd step, learning, the algorithm compares the predicted outcomes against the model. Depending on outcomes, it integrates these findings back into the model or dismisses them. That prediction step is often called the black box, because sometimes even the creators aren't sure how the machine learning works. So remember, when you're looking at AI, you're looking at an invisible labor force. The data does not collect itself. There are 3 types of invisible labor that go into making artificial intelligence. There's the labor creating the data sets, the labor training the models, and when all else fails, the labor that pretends to be the AI itself. Consider an Amazon mechanical Turk worker, a human laboring on a platform that is cheekily called artificial intelligence. These workers are all 3 types of invisible labor mentioned previously. They collect and process data, they train the models, and collectively they are considered a substitute for AI. Many of the American workers are isolated in rural areas with fewer job opportunities. The majority make less than $2 an hour with no certainty of a day's work. Tasks are created by clients who control price, time, and requirements. Workers are at the mercy of client approval and deadline set. On top of this, Amazon controls the platform and takes a portion of the pay, leaving no ability for negotiation. Unlike a salary job, small breaks, sick days, vacation, none of it is compensated. And why not pay mechanical truckers a living wage, and why not provide them the same benefits and securities had by full-time employees? Because the whole platform is based on the premise that there could be a vast network of cheap task fulfillers. Jeff Bezos says, but artificial intelligence like Mechanical Turk invert all that. The computer has a task that is easy for a human, but extraordinarily hard for the computer. So instead of calling a computer service to perform the function, it calls a human. When Bezos says this, he is dismissing the humans behind the work by shifting what AI means. The system exploits people, relying on a surplus labor market without negotiation power. Just because Mechanical Turk gives the impression of creating opportunity doesn't mean it's creating a healthy way of living. Mechanical Turk workers perform all 3 types of invisible labor mentioned earlier. They collect data sets, such as providing translations. They train models, such as labeling images, and collectively, as a vast resource, they are jokingly called AI. And if it was not enough to source underpaid labor to contractors, a new startup is rising to the challenge of capitalistic greed by using prison labor. Venue, a data sourcing company, is paying Finnish prisoners to classify data used in training AI. Prisoners are being paid similar rates to Mechanical Turk workers, with the prison management in charge of pay distribution and negotiation. A captive workforce is an easily exploited one. Artificial intelligence is built with all of the same biases of capitalistic power structures baked in. The data doesn't collect itself. Mechanical torpors and Finnish prisoners represent the invisible labor mentioned earlier. They create data sets and train the models of AI. And so the third one, this fake AI happens more often than you would think. AI assistants are often just overworked people pretending to be a bot. Whether reading emails and scheduling like Zai or searching up flight schedules like Go Butler, this is really just outsourced labor management. Not only that, but as soon as the technology does reach sophistication, these workers are often discarded. When humans work to accomplish what AI falls so short of doing, they become people pretending to be robots pretending to be people. And when the outside world thinks they are robots, their work becomes hidden. The work that goes into machine learning is worth viewing through a socialist feminist lens. As Astra Taylor points out in her article, The Automation Charade, the socialist feminist tradition is a powerful resource because it's certainly concerned with what work is, and in particular, how capitalism lives and grows by concealing certain kinds of work, refusing to pay for it, and pretending it's not, in fact, work at all. If we believe the kind of AI that involves a person pretending to be a robot, and if we believe AI to be work done by robots, then we are less likely to consider the humans behind the work. We are less likely to see the labor as valuable and support them. By making these workers more visible, we start to dismantle these structures of power. Recently, over 900 Google employees have signed a letter of protest against the company's treatment of TVC, temporary contract vendor workers. The protest came over the abrupt contract shortening of 80% of the Google Assistant personalities team, the 34 workers that write the language and shape the personality of the AI that had their contracts ended early. Google told them that offering support or even thanking us for years of work would make the company legally liable. Our teammates were told to distance themselves from us at the moment when we were most in need, just so that Google could avoid legal responsibility. Managers and coworkers were unable to express empathy and compassion to their fellow teammates who had just been laid off. We demand that Google respect and uphold existing contracts. We also demand that Google as a whole respect the work of contractors like those of the personality team. Finally, we demand that Google respect our humanity. In the letter to Google, the contractors asked for their contracts to be respected by paying out the remaining time, for their humanity to be respected by allowing full-time employees to openly empathize with fired contractors, and for their work to be respected by converting contractor to full-time. The Google workers signing this letter are starting to make the steps necessary to create better futures in technology. We must recognize our fellow workers as humans, advocate on their behalf, and build the solidarity necessary. Only by seeing the people in the machine can we advocate, organize, and build solidarity that spans the full extent of tech labor. Thanks.
Right, my talk is called Goals, and it's about measurement, control, and capitalist realism and mediated leisure. Sorry, right. So, my central thesis is the internet isn't dreaming anymore. There's a chart from Google Trends that illustrates this. So I want to ask the question, where have our dreams gone and what do we have instead? Instead, we seem to have goals. Our dreams are in decline, they're being replaced by goals. We've got all sorts of goals. We have relationship goals, friendship goals, makeup goals, home goals, wedding goals, fitness goals, family goals, travel goals, style goals, food goals. Almost any aspect of our life can now be characterized as a goal to be achieved. And this concerns me. Why be worried by a fairly subtle linguistic trend? Why do goals in particular trouble me? To me, there's an important difference between a goal and a dream. Goals have two properties that bother me and which make them a symptom of a larger social malaise, which I think is worth examining. Firstly, goals imply a sort of pragmatic outlook. They're achievable within the status quo. And secondly, they imply something that's measurable. A goal has this known, unambiguous state of being achieved or not. Both these things might sound fairly benign. However, I think it's worth considering what's lost when our aspirations become more short-term and are limited to the measurable, and also having a look at where this kind of metricization of our daily lives might have come from. To do that, I think a really good place to start is the work of Mark Fisher. Mark was a cultural theorist, political activist, blogger, writer, and educator who died in 2017. He was among the first cultural theory writers who were extremely online. His work was native to the internet, as that's where the majority of it was produced. His blog, K-Punk, was started as a space to maintain a type of cultural discourse that Mark saw as missing from academia, a discourse that presented theory in accessible everyday terms, making connections with popular culture, grassroots activism, and everyday life. Mark published a great deal of work in the academic press, but many of his ideas were germinated through posts on K-Punk and the community of music, pop culture, and politics blogs of which it was a part. This is what makes Mark's work so interesting for me. It is of the internet without always being about the internet. Because Mark's work was predominantly expressed through the internet as a medium, the conditions of working online shaped his theories, but he didn't attempt to reify the online as a concept in his work. I think this makes it especially relevant to understanding the cultural shifts that the encroachment of the big social media platforms into online space have entailed, as it helps us draw parallels with more general social, cultural, and political shifts happening both online and off. It's these parallels that I'd like to examine, because for me, this metricization of our online sociality is less about the encroachment of technology itself into our leisure time, as it is to do with the encroachment of a managerial capitalist ideology which predates the internet as a technology. It's the ideology that Mark called capitalist realism. Capitalist realism is summed up in a quote which is attributed sometimes to Frederick Jameson, sometimes to Slavoj Zizek, and it goes, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." For Mark, this observation was key to understanding many aspects of life under late capitalism. There are three particularly important aspects to it. First is that the exploitation of capital is as much effective as it is... So, three important aspects. First is the exploitation of capital is as much effective as it is economic. It's an atmosphere that conditions how we think and feel. Second, it constrains our thought and action. It sets limits on what is perceived to be possible. And third, it's pervasive. It affects every aspect of our lives. One key part of this is what he calls the business ontology, the axiom that it is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as if it was a business. This dominant form and narrative of business in this case is post-Fordism, which for Mark was particularly significant. Rather than the kind of Fordist or Taylorist model by which workers are surveyed and measured by a separate group of managers who sit elsewhere and have a separate role, under capitalist realism we are required to be our own auditors. As well as the way in which post-Fordist workers are literally complicit in their own control through this type of self-measurement, Mark also identified the way in which the language of capitalism functions as a form of control. In particular, how the language of entrepreneurialism and competition has infected much of our lives, and how this serves to further the cause of capitalist realism, making any alternative to it seem even more remote. Finally, he identified that the dominance of capitalist realism entailed the breaking down of divisions between our working and non-working selves, and that we are increasingly required to perform qualities such as enthusiasm, creativity, and self-expression in our own working lives. Now, if I wanted to imagine a manifesto for Fisher's dystopian vision, I probably couldn't do better than The Brand Called You, which is the 1997 Fast Company article by management consultant and motivational speaker Tom Peters, who has been variously and hilariously described as the Red Bull of management thinkers and a human exclamation point who no longer needs his last name. The Brand Called You is credited with coining the concept of the personal brand, and it's a terrifyingly sober articulation of everything Fisher would rail against 12 years later in capitalist realism. The idea of a personal brand is pervasive in today's world, and Peters links it explicitly to the idea of bringing post-Fordist strategies of measurement into one's personal life. He encourages the would-be brand to think, breathe, and act and work in projects, due to the fact that the project is an atomic unit of effort which affords measurement. He also advocates for personal mission statements and regular personal focus groups to evaluate the progress of Brand You. While the 1997 version of this might seem far-fetched, these are precisely the mechanisms that are afforded and encouraged by modern social media platforms. Capital in 2019 relies less on things like focus groups and more on things like passively tracked KPIs and analytics than Capital did in 1997. And the same technologies are not just available to us, but are imposed on us as we go about our leisure activities on these platforms. Follower and like counts, trending topics, things like this, the platforms are built to afford measurement, comparison, and competition, and therefore the self-policing of our private selves in a way that is sanctioned by capital. This can lead to a form of virtual presenteeism in various lines of work, particularly those who are precariously employed. Barbering, I think, is an interesting example of this. There's a whole kind of barbering Instagram culture, which is a huge thing, but it's not just a kind of medium for showcasing your craft. It's a culture and a community and a lifestyle which are all-encompassing, and which which people are expected to take part in as part of their work. But this isn't just about the way we present our work selves online, it's about the way we present and see ourselves full stop. Hence my fascination with goals. They're measurable and they're pervasive. They employ both the language and, via the social media platforms, the affordances of post-Fordism to our personal lives, encouraging us to view the world in these terms. This is a vicious circle. The crisis of imagination which brought us the world of managerialist measurement compounds itself. We can no longer imagine a future outside of it. We no longer have dreams, we only have goals. And what better way to illustrate this cycle than in the cases where people's dreams and aspirations have been assumed into another opportunity for labor in the service of capital. As an example, Oliver Lee Bateman, writing in Mel magazine earlier this year, describes the life of Alex Jimenez. Alex is the yacht guy, his king of yachting Instagram with over 800,000 followers. Jimenez is a former short-haul truck driver and yacht enthusiast from the Bronx, and he saw Instagram and the burgeoning influencer industry as a means of parlaying his love of yachts into a career, only to realize that the work of an influencer is often precarious and piecemeal, performing this illusion of affluence and leisure for his audience in order to eke out a living promoting yacht brokers who then profit off the back of his labor. So, we've seen how social media platforms encode the language and instrumentation of post-Fordist capital and afforded a way of seeing the world and presenting ourselves that brings its logic into our private lives. Is there any solution to this? Something that limiting our time on these platforms is the solution. Joe Edelman is a former engineer and self-styled philosopher who coined the term time well spent. Time well spent is a movement which advocates for the designers of network technologies to build services with human values in mind and which allow more intentional interactions with these services. Time well spent's analysis of many of the problems of digital platforms is prescient, in particular the way in which the mechanisms of addictive gambling devices are co-opted by the designers of digital services to drive engagement. However, in their strategies for resistance, they also appeal to the capitalist realist mechanism of measurement and aspiration. In his 2016 essay, Is Anything Worth Maximizing?, Edelman advocates for what he calls whole-person analytics and reason-based metrics, the ability for users to enumerate their aspirations or reasons for action, and to measure the time spent on activities in service of these aspirations. This conception has little space for the surprising or the ludic, to be idle or to dream. It also follows this post-Fordist practice of self-auditing, advocating that users police their own screen time in order to limit its harmful effects. In this way, it fails to challenge the logic of measurement, which is central to this capitalist realist position, and central to challenging the logic of the platforms. So, what can be done? If both the digital platforms and the strategies to resist their most harmful effects are steeped in the logic of capital, is this merely a vindication of Marx's conception of capitalist realism, that no coherent alternative can be imagined, that in the words of one of neoliberalism's most famous architects, there is no alternative? In the introduction to his unfinished work, Acid Communism, Marx points to a glimmer of hope, arguing that the dominance of the capitalist realist position is in fact a specific response to the fact that the material conditions for total liberation from capital have never actually been better. For Marx, the very dominance of the capitalist realist ideology was a symptom of the waning power of capital over our lives and a sign that alternative ways of being were becoming possible. These alternatives, according to Marx, were centered around the collective capacity to produce, care, and enjoy, those aspects of life which capital must always obstruct. In focusing on both the ludic and the collective, Marx's ideas mirror those of Jody Dean, on whose work I will end. In a talk called Selfie Communism, Dean defines the idea of communicative capitalism, a capitalism which exploits communication in the same way as industrial capitalism exploits labor. She goes on to identify strategies for resistance which closely complement Fisher's ideas. Following the Marxist edict that capitalism produces its own gravediggers, she identified the ways in which communicative capitalism has produced new opportunities for collectivity in the form of the creative, playful combination of images, speech, and text as a communicative medium, with examples like fandoms, reaction gifs, memes, and selfies. For Dean, these uses of images subordinate the individual subject of the image to its power to be circulated by the collective. The identity of a singular person flows into collective expression of common feelings. What's interesting to me about this secondary visuality, as Dean terms it, is that it precisely resists the qualities of capitalist realism we discussed above. The way in which images derive their expressive power through circulation and assemblage resists the capitalist idea of ownership and value through scarcity. The combination of images and text resists the mechanisms of measurement and analysis dominant on social media platforms today, and this should give us some hope, even within platforms built on the ideology of capitalist realism, our human communality and playfulness can prosper. Thank you very much.
So maybe it would make sense for you all to come up here so folks can answer questions.
Maybe I'll stand over here.
So I'll go ahead and take stack if folks want to ask questions of the panel or anyone individually. Do you want the mic for live stream?
Thanks for all of your talks. Rafaela, I had a question for you. Your research sounds fascinating. And in particular, the way that the kind of infrastructure of WhatsApp. And I was wondering if, obviously, we can't all be experts in kind of what's happening in right-wing meme spheres all over the world, but I was wondering if you could speak to kind of any parallels that you've seen between kind of right-wing Brazilian WhatsApp group meme circulation and production and yeah, what's happening in the UK or what's happening here in the United States.
Yeah, it's funny you ask because we were talking about this. It is very similar, the same kind of, even in the memes, the same way of expressing these narratives, how they use the images of these narratives. They are very similar across, even the UK, in Brazil, and here in the US. And one thing that I really like doing, well, not liking, go to the comment sections in online news website. You go and you see that very similar narratives, right-wing narratives across the world. Is that, but yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I've been doing some research for my master's about how nonprofit organizations use digital tools to resist neoliberal policy, specifically in food and agriculture sectors. And what I've been really curious about is, how can you really use the products of, exploitative systems to then resist those systems in turn? And I was curious what you have to say about, using tools such as, the internet, memes, whatever. Are they actually forms of resistance, or are they methods of coping?
So I came across an example in my research on some students on a HCI paper from CMU, and they were actually working with Amazon Turk workers to try to bring some kind of organization to those workers. And so working collaborative with them, they built a plugin on Amazon so workers could rate and review potential clients to try to add some level of control or some level of transparency. I think there's in the world that we are, you're never going to have a pure thing that's untouched by some exploitation somewhere. So sometimes it is about how can we alternate these systems to start dismantling the powers that we can, and recognizing that somewhere along the way in what you're doing with, it's going to have adverse effects in some ways. Yeah.
Does anyone else want to take?
I have some very vague thoughts. They're probably not going to be very well formed, but there's something interesting about, in particular, the ways in which. Okay. So first, the fundamental point, I guess, is that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. To some extent, you are going to be engaging with incredibly problematic things, and that is essentially a fact of this, which I'm not sure much can be done about. The second thing I think that's interesting to sort of further Sarah's point about agency is these things can be designed with kind of more or less levels of agency for the people using them. And there's an interesting book by a guy called Jonathan Zittrain that came out years ago where he talks about, he has this concept of generativity in interactive services where he talks about generative media being things that can be recombined, can be put to uses that they weren't designed for. And I think there's a sliding scale here. There are things that are very rigid, very kind of controlled, that do not allow you to kind of resist or find new forms of expression. And then there are things that allow kind of recombination and playfulness and kind of unforeseen consequences. So I guess I have no real answer, but there is definitely some interesting subtleties there.
Just a question to build on the gentleman in front regarding WhatsApp. Did you mention the group size is still 256 people? Yeah, it seems that that is actually different than the structures of the communication devices used by other groups. It seems more cellular. I mean, if you can't broadcast a message to beyond more than 256 people, then you do need connecting nodes between them, and that seems like it would foster perhaps more intimacy and more immediacy amongst those groups, maybe to give some description for how, some justification for how virulent they become. It's very tribal, more so than the broadcast mechanic of Twitter or large, 70,000, 700,000 person Facebook groups. Seems
Because, and as you said, the intimacy in WhatsApp is way more intimate than Twitter and Facebook. And this is the thing, because then is your aunt or your grandmother sending you inaccurate information, and then is your grandmother, and you're going, okay, which one is going to speak louder there? Wait more. The information in itself, or the attachment that you have to this person that is sending you this information. And once it's there, so you have public groups in WhatsApp, but you also have the majority are private groups and smaller groups. 90% of the messages in WhatsApp are between two people, and only the majority of the groups are public groups. The majority are with 10 or less people. So, and then once these informations are there into the smaller and more private groups, then there are a lot going on that we cannot really know. Just the feelings. Yes.
Did I see a hand in the back?
Hey, thank you everybody for a bunch of really interesting presentations. I wanted to backtrack a little bit to the discussion about agency we were just having a few minutes ago. So I have a question for the first presenter. You talked about how these apps are a site of biopower in some really interesting ways, but I was wondering if you could speculate a little bit about how folks might deviate from that script and use it in different ways that are not anticipated by the companies. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's kind of what we were talking about earlier, is like, how do you take the tools of capitalism and subvert them? It's interesting to kind of think about in terms of like pregnancy and fertility apps when you're offering up so much data. Some of it is sort of rooted in like empirical data, and other data that it's collecting are kind of like your mood, how you're feeling, and so I think there's definitely space for people to kind of step in and try to subvert that data collection. I think there's also potential to, like for the example I gave of Ovia, which is being used in the workplace, since the employer is seeing it in an aggregate way, there is also potential for people to collectively maybe work together to sort of bypass that. So yeah, we haven't really seen it too much yet because they've only recently been introduced into the workplace.
Hey, this question's also for Becca. So I'm curious if you had any thoughts on the concept of like data as labor. So for instance, if the companies behind these pregnancy and fertility applications would compensate people for using or monetizing their data, how would that change the power dynamic, if any, and would that actually be beneficial?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting conversation we're having, especially as I think the news came out that a lot of these apps do monetize that data and they commodify and they sell it to marketers. So it is that question of like, are people willing to pay for that service, and would that be one model? Or is it a matter of sort of making sure people consent and they know that that data is being used in that way? I think most people probably wouldn't consent to their data being used that way, but I think what's lacking is sort of a fundamental question of consent.
Hi, just a quick follow-up in this conversation. For the first presenter, but if any of you have thoughts as well, I'm wondering if you think open source softwares have any potentials for, I don't know, enabling workers' autonomy and bargaining power, like in the example of the first one, if it was an open source app, so that the data that was collected was not being sold to marketing, but the tool was still available for people who did want to track themselves for one reason or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what's powerful about those tools, and I kind of talked about this in my presentation, is they're simultaneously pleasurable because you're able to understand and track your own data, but then they also kind of exercise that normative control, is that you're able to sort of weigh your own experience against the experience of like millions of other people, whoever's using the app or whatever data they're weighing it against. So, yeah. Anyone else want to answer that?
Hi, thanks for your presentations. Actually, I was just going to respond on exactly
Yeah,
that point, to
go
just
for it.
point out that just a few weeks ago, there was a group called the Bloody Health Collective, which is a group of feminist coders in Berlin who are looking for a safer way to track their periods. So what they've done is they've built an open source app to manage things like targeted advertising and third-party data sharing. And anyway, so I just wanted to say that it's responding to the privacy issue and the data trade issue, but it still sort of keeps open the point of, do you need to quantify yourself? Have we just sort of accepted that, yeah, we just do this now, as long as somebody is not buying and selling our data, it's okay. You know, this
Right.
is how, this is a slippery slope. I'm going to also just tweet the link to the podcast featuring that group in response. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, thanks for that.
So a few of you spoke about how care and a lot of the labor that we put into the commons is sort of chopped up and brought into managerial capitalism. I'm curious what you think an alternative would look like. So specifically, if you were designing a platform for some sort of digital altruism, say to get you to spontaneously do good or care for others or contribute to the commons in some way, what would be a necessary feature that you would want in that?
I can probably speak to things I leave out. So, like this is my kind of specific interest in a lot of this stuff because my work is loosely around product design and online product design. And I think one of the really interesting questions is there is a sort of default in how we do things online that if something can be measured or can be kind of expressed as a count of things or a competition, we show that to people because why not? It's there in a database and we have that information. And I think one of the really interesting things is abdicating the ability to count or to quantify or to compete and designing things without those particular signals. So I don't know if I can speak positively to like active interventions, but I think one very interesting thing to do would be to leave out some of the kind of quantification of action and some of the affordances that imply a kind of hierarchy or competition, and to see where that gets you. I mean, it's a thing I'd like to test, but it's a hunch, I guess.
My question is for Rafaela. I wonder, I'm sorry if you touched on this during your presentation, but was there any intervention during the strike where actors would intervene and pretended to steer the conversation a different way, to subvert the organization or the organizing that was occurring?
It was in these groups, because I was in 2 groups, and there was no, I cannot answer if there was some planning or intentional intervention in these groups. It felt very organic. It felt very, so once the narratives started to be disseminated and they were appropriated by the strikers themselves, and then that appropriation, that reshapes when you get someone else's narrative and it becomes yours. And then you start seeing it slightly different, what you wanted, what your aims were, and that's what the change. So in the group that night, waiting for the midnight strokes, it was amazing because even though I was aware of what's happening, I was there as an observant, a researcher, but at moments I kind of forgot about it because it was very intense. It was very like a lot of videos being shared, a lot is coming, and montages with the army. And the soundtrack at the end with the army leaving the army place and coming to the street. So it's about to happen, and then nothing. So it was kind of very organic, and yeah, unique in that sense.
Hi, I have a question for the second presenter. It sounds, what you're talking about, the businessmen hijacking the movements, it sounds a lot to me sort of like a virus taking over an existing cell, and a lot of what you're talking about, these messages spreading, also sounds a lot like a lot of public health work about how disease spreads and epidemiology, and I'm wondering if there's any sort of crossover work between the type of stuff you're doing with how information spreads and then the sort of work that maybe like an epidemiologist would do or a public health official would do in trying to figure out like how disease or viruses spread, if there's any crossover there.
Is it no, but very interesting. There is some researchers in my school that are, making those connections, but no, it does look, kind of represents the virus is spreading the misinformation, hijacking. But how I see it is the virus were already there, and because already, the feelings of discontent and hopelessness is already there, it's widely experienced by all kinds of people, because it is in a deep systemic crisis, Brazil and the world, many places across the world. So it gets, it's just like when something else happens, it's easy to trigger all those deep, discontent that is already there. So you trigger, and then it comes to the surface again once it was deep there, and then something else happens and you bring, and then it could go anywhere. More like that's how I'm approaching it rather than the virus thing. Thank you.
For the stream.
Hi, thanks to everybody for interesting papers. My question is for Becca, but maybe also for Tim in relation to the goals versus dreams. I'm wondering with some of these self-tracking apps that sort of triangulate other people's data, but also your biological data with your moods. So for instance, there's this really great example where somebody's like on a date and they think they're having a good time and they're like, I'm so into this person, but then they have this self-tracking, then their heart rate is like, no, I'm not excited. And they're like, oh, wait, do I not like this person? And so I'm wondering if you could talk about how the biological data is correlated with people's subjective data and which one takes primacy. And I think that has something to do with goals and dreams as well. So it's a big question, but.
Yeah, no, this, so earlier research I was doing a couple years ago was around the experience people had seeing targeted ads, and specifically sort of ads that women were seeing, which were usually health focused. And that was a huge theme of the interviews I did with women, was sort of thinking about okay, I had this kind of expectation of how I was feeling about when I would choose to have a kid or what my friends were doing, but now I'm seeing targeted ads that suggest that all my friends maybe are having kids, and that's why I'm seeing these advertisements. And so there is sort of a way in which those categories, those cybernetic categories, do exercise power. And most of the people I talked to said it really made them question their own kind of life judgments. They're like, I'm 20 years old and I'm not thinking about having a baby, but now I am because I saw the advertisement, because I think everyone else is. So I think there is sort of that feedback loop that happens, and it becomes difficult for people to kind of tease out how they feel about it versus how sort of everyone else feels about it.
Thanks. So I think you've really, really precisely hit on my kind of problem with measurement and tracking in general, and so it's sort of the way I see it, and I can't cite this very well at the moment, is there's a kind of the idea of self-tracking, the idea of the kind of quantified self, is based in this this kind of epistemic view of the world that all that is true is that which is measurable, and there's essentially no place for subjectivity in that worldview. So you get to there's a lot of this discourse is about things that are not measurable cannot be real, and you see this a lot in kind of discourse about mental health. People go, well, if you have, say, depression, people go, I want to see your serotonin levels, and the kind of subjective experience of it is discounted. So there's this is essentially you're entirely right, and it's a really insidious problem, and I think the where it becomes really tricky is in those feedback loops where it kind of butts up against people's sort of lived experience of themselves. But yeah, I don't know if I know any way of kind of reconciling these things beyond just measuring less and quantifying less. But yeah, as you said, I think this is precisely the problem with a lot of this kind of technology and this kind of discourse.
We've got 3 more minutes left if anyone has a burning question.
So Rafaela, one point I was really interested in is the point where you described how someone in one of these groups kind of expressed doubt about the sort of collective position and were kind of jumped on with links and links and links to videos and all sorts of stuff, and then they kind of capitulated and went, oh no, you're right. And I was wondering if you had a view on whether how much the kind of content of those video links was important to that, whether it was the material itself or whether it was just like the sort of volume of references that was being put to them. Is there anything, how much would you say the kind of content of these videos that are being circulated is important, and how much do you think just the sort of the presence and the volume of these kind of citations is doing a lot of the work of kind of managing and controlling?
I think it goes, it's something else. This kind of like the principle of agreement. What I'm exploring is like how the offline world is kind of structuring our online worlds as well. So we do have a saying in Brazil that we don't discuss politics, football, soccer, or religion. These are matters that we shouldn't discuss. But we have to discuss, and we are discussing, but we're not debating it. We're just sharing our opinions, just saying what we want, what our opinions, and it's my opinion, and it's my opinion, and we're not debating these issues that we should be debating. So what I'm interested in is how these sayings in the offline world are also structuring our online interactions in this space that could be really appropriate to have this kind of debates, right? WhatsApp, you have, your family group, your friends group, and you can share your views and engage in discussion and change your mind perhaps, or help someone else that cannot see this particular point to see it differently. But we're not doing that, unfortunately, because this is what I think right now is because these old sayings, this saying from offline world is kind of structuring how we interact in online worlds as well.
To kind of like piggyback off Tim's question, I was curious, do the WhatsApp groups have any forms of like moderation of like kicking people out of a group? Because it kind of sounds like they're just piling on the videos, but do they ever like force someone out, or is that just a way to silence people?
Yeah, you can't, like, it's a democratic space in a sense, democratic, because anyone can kick anyone else out. So, for example, I saw that happen. If you start questioning a lot, say, this is fake news, this is not, like, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do this, they go and take this person out as well. If you don't agree, you leave, or someone forces you to leave, kind of like.
We are right at 1:15, so have a great break, everyone. Thanks. Thank you so much.